1953, in a small kitchen in San Antonio, a 15-cent can of tomatoes could be the beginning of an entire dinner. A bag of rice sat close to the wooden cutting board, beside a cabbage, a few potatoes, and the recipe box, its lid worn at the corners. In the cast-iron skillet, the bacon grease was still warm, softly sizzling as the first few grains of rice touched the surface. That kitchen had few tools and short cooking steps, but every movement required experience. The cook knew when the rice was just fragrant enough to add the onion, when to lower the heat, and when there was enough food in the pot to serve everyone around the table. She needed a few ingredients. She needed to understand them. Among the 25 cards about to be read, dish number 22 is named after a type of seafood, even though it contains no oysters. Dish number 10 turns a can of mushroom soup into a dinner that looks as though it came from a restaurant. Dish number 1 returns to rice, tomatoes, and the flavor left behind in the skillet. If this kitchen reminds you of someone who once cooked from memory in her hands, subscribe to the channel. Each week, the recipe box will open again beneath the kitchen light. The first card is drawn. It carries the blue color of the box that once stood in many post-war pantries. Boxed foods, cast iron, and early week soupers. Before frozen meal trays filled supermarket freezer aisles, convenience in the family kitchen took a simpler form. It might have been a box of pasta on the shelf, a length of sausage wrapped in wax paper, a bowl of cornmeal beside the salt jar, and a cast-iron skillet beginning to give off warmth. After a long day, the person at the stove still had to listen for the sound of boiling water, watch the color of the fat in the pan, and know when it was time to put dinner on the table. Dish number 25. Boxed macaroni and cheese steam, carrying the smell of starch fogged the window, as the softened pieces of macaroni were poured into a metal colander. As hot water fell into the sink, with a series of light tap-downs, while the blue box sat open on the counter. In Chicago in 1956, in families where someone worked in a factory or meatpacking plant, a box of macaroni often cost about 19 cents. With a little milk and margarine added, about 25 cents could make a hot pot of dinner for the entire family. He poured the macaroni back into the pot, added the margarine while the bottom was still warm, and then poured in the milk very slowly. The packet of cheese powder fell in as a cloud of pale orange dust. The wooden spoon moved in steady circles, pulling the sauce over every piece of macaroni until the surface became smooth and glossy. Sometimes the adults added black pepper. The children usually sat closer, waiting for the sound of the spoon striking the side of the pot to stop. The dish still exists, but the memory of a family gathering around a small pot and considering it a complete dinner has gradually faded. The little box had once been enough. Dish number 24, fried bologna with onions. The moment the first slice of bologna touched the hot grease, its edges immediately curled inward. A sharp, distinct sizzle rang out, followed by the smell of smoked meat spreading beyond the kitchen. She cut a few slits around each slice so it would lie flatter, then let the underside turn deep brown before flipping it. In Winston-Salem in 1954, a skillet of bologna cooked with onions cost about 55 cents. For tobacco worker families in Forsyth County, it was a meal quick enough to prepare after a shift, but yet still fragrant enough to make the house feel as though it were waiting for someone to come home. When the edges of the meat were charred, she lifted each slice onto an enamel plate. The thinly sliced onions were dropped into the remaining grease, gradually softening and turning the color of honey. The first loud sizzle settled into a small, steady, gentle sound. The dish could be eaten with white bread, potatoes, or a fried egg. The smell of onions often traveled down the hallway before the sound of work shoes stopped outside the door. The smell of onions called people home. Dish number 20. Hot water cornbread. Boiling water was poured directly into a bowl of cornmeal and salt. Steam rose close to the face. That's while the mixture thickened so quickly that the hands had to work while the heat was still held within every grain of meal. In 1951, in the kitchens of foundry workers in Birmingham, Jefferson County, a batch of hot water cornbread cost only about 17 cents. She scooped the mixture into her palm, shaped it into small pieces, and dropped them into a skillet of grease. Bubbles formed around the edges, while the oil murmured beneath the crust as it gradually turned golden. The cornbread was placed beside stewed beans, greens, or a bowl of hot gravy. The recipe used few ingredients and took little time to prepare. There was still bread on the table, fresh from the skillet, crisp on the outside and soft within. Three things became supper. Once the skillet was hot, the kitchen could do even more with whatever was growing in the garden or stored in the pantry. Cabbage, corn kernels, and a few familiar vegetables would make their way to the center of the table, carrying with them the colors of the season and cooking methods that hands had once committed to memory. Cabbage, corn, and the garden skillet. In the old kitchen, vegetables sometimes took up the largest portion of the plate. On some days, cabbage was cooked until tender and sweet and became dinner itself. On other days, corn brought the crispest, most fragrant bite to the table. There were also afternoons when two kinds of vegetables taken from the pantry were enough to keep the whole family gathered together. Beneath the yellow light, the color of cooked corn, the pale green of the beans, the glossy layer of butter in the skillet made familiar ingredients feel warmer. Dish number 20. Mock oyster corn fritters. Spoonfuls of corn batter were dropped into hot oil, immediately spreading into small oval shape. The oil sizzled around the edges of the fritters, while the yellow kernels of corn remained visible beneath the batter as it began to set. She stood beside the stove, tilting the spoon slightly so that each fritter had just the right thickness, then waited until the outer edges turned the color of honey. In 1955, in Burlington, Des Moines County, Iowa, a batch of fritters like these cost about 60 cents. In railroad workers' households and farming families, summer corn was cut from the cob right on the cutting board, then mixed with flour, eggs, and milk. The thick mixture was spooned into the skillet in portions and fried until the outside was crisp, while the inside retained the soft sweetness of the corn kernels. The name mock oyster came from the oval shape, which resembled the fried oysters that had once appeared on dinner tables. The fritters contained no seafood, but the playful name often made children inspect the plate carefully before taking their first bite. One summer ingredient had become a dish that was both amusing to look at and substantial enough to stand at the center of dinner. There were no oysters. The fritters were still memorable. Dish number 21. Cabbage and noodles. Freshly sliced cabbage still carried a green, slightly pungent smell. When it fell into the buttered skillet, the strands began to soften, turning glossy and gradually becoming pale yellow. A wooden spoon pushed the cabbage back and forth, creating a dry rustling sound at first, which later softened into a moist, gentle sound as the vegetable released its juices. In McKeesport in 1953, a skillet of cabbage and noodles large enough for a family cost about 41 cents. The dish followed Polish and Slovak steelworker families to Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. She sliced the cabbage into very thin strands and cooked it slowly in butter until its sharpness faded and gave way to sweetness. Egg noodles were boiled separately, drained, and then mixed into the skillet with salt and plenty of black pepper. Outside the window, the glow from the steelworks sometimes still burned red against the sky. When the end-of-shift whistle sounded in the distance, the skillet of noodles was already hot and heavy in the hand, filling enough for those returning after long hours spent amid smoke, dust, and metal. The cabbage still remembered the factory whistle. Dish number 20. Corn and lima beans cooked in butter. The sweet corn kernels popped lightly beneath the spoon, nestled among softened lima beans, coated in a glossy layer of butter. The scent of warm milk rose with the steam from the vegetables, gentler than the sound of frying oil from the earlier dishes. In the enamel bowl, the yellow corn rested beside the pale green beans like two pieces of summer preserved. In 1955, in Fall River, Bristol County, Massachusetts, a batch of corn and lima beans cost about 49 cents. In textile workers' households, she cooked the beans until their centers were tender, then added corn, butter, and a little milk or cream. The pot was kept over low heat so that the sweetness, richness, and vegetable juices blended into a lightly thickened sauce. The dish carried with it a technique that had existed for generations and adapted to the canned and frozen vegetables of the post-war era. Because of that, the flavors of summer could still return on a cold evening after the work shift had ended, and a shawl still carried the smell of textile fibers. Two kinds of kernels had been preserved for an entire season, but vegetables told only part of the story. Rice, dried beans, and a little flour remained on the shelf, ingredients that could sit quietly for many days, waiting for a low flame and time to fill the bowl. Riens, the what remoned at the ballen of the pot. Some dinners were made with patience more than with hands. The flame was turned low, the lid fitted tightly into place, and the kitchen gradually grew quiet around the steady simmer at the bottom of the pot. Flour dissolved into fat, dried beans absorbed the flavor of a ham bone, and potatoes slowly softened among milk and corn. Time did the hardest work while the cook continued with the day's remaining chores. Dish number 19. Rice with gravy. Black pepper fell in specks across the pale brown gravy. The wooden spoon moved through the skillet, leaving a clear trail along the bottom before the gravy slowly closed over it again. The smell of toasted flour blended with the pan drippings, which still carried the aroma of meat, creating a scent warmer and richer than the dish's simple appearance suggested. In Lafayette in 1952, Cajun farm worker families could make a batch of rice with gravy for about 34 cents. She saved the drippings after frying the meat, sprinkled in flour, and stirred until the flour changed color. Milk or water was poured in a little at a time while she stirred constantly to make the gravy smooth. A pinch of salt and plenty of black pepper completed the flavor before the gravy was spooned over hot rice. The grains of rice beneath the gravy were soft, glossy, and fragrant with the scent of the skillet. It remained from the previous dish had brought flavor to the entire plate. Gravy made the rice go farther. Dish number 18. Red beans and rice. On Monday morning, a pot of beans had already begun to stir on the stove before the wash tub was set on the floor. Beneath the heavy lid, small bubbles rose and gently burst, carrying the smell of onion, celery, bell pepper, and ham bone through the room. In 1952, in New Orleans, a pot of red beans and rice cost about 53 cents in the homes of dock workers and laundry workers. The beans were soaked the night before, the kitchen had been cleaned, and the lamp was about to be put out. The next morning she placed the beans in a pot with the ham bone, aromatic vegetables, and water, then let the dish simmer for hours. The beans thickened on their own, her hands moved on to scrubbing shirts, wringing out towels, and hanging each piece of still dripping cloth. By afternoon, the beans had softened, and the liquid had turned reddish-brown and lightly coated the spoon. She ladled the beans over white rice, sometimes scattering freshly chopped green onions on top. Mondays belonged to beans. Dish number 17, cream corn sup. The potatoes were so tender that they began to break apart as soon as the edge of the spoon touched them. Small pieces of potato dissolved into the milk, gradually thickening the soup around the yellow kernels of corn. The scents of salt pork, onion, and hot milk blended, making the kitchen near the harbor feel gentler on a cold evening. In Portland, Cumberland County, Maine, 1951, a pot of creamed corn soup cost about 84 cents. In the homes of dock workers and fish processing workers, she fried the salt pork first, waiting for the clear fat to render into the bottom of the pan. The onions and potatoes were stirred in that fat until they became fragrant, and only then were the corn and milk added. The soup was kept over low heat so the potatoes could gradually soften while the milk retained its mild flavor. When it was ladled into bowls, the creamy white and yellow soup still held whole kernels of corn with saltine crackers or slices of bread beside it to soak up the last of the liquid. Outside, the wind from the docks might still slip through the collar of a coat. Inside, the potatoes made the pot warmer. Among the yellowed cards in the recipe box, one corner of a card still bore the circular mark left by the bottom of a can. That small stain carried the story into the era when canned food entered the kitchen and was transformed by the cook's hands into a dinner far larger than the original can. One has to go further. A can sitting on the shelf was only the beginning of dinner. The cook still had to open it, drain the liquid, heat the skillet, and then add potatoes, onions, or tomatoes. In experienced hands, that food that had once sat motionless inside cold metal gradually took on the aroma, color, and heat of a meal cooked right at home. The pop of the can lid lasted only a moment, but it was followed by a whole sequence of sounds: a knife striking the cutting board, fat sizzling at the bottom of the pot, and a spoon stirring through broth as it began to thicken. Dish number 16. Vienna Sori Stew. Small sausages which rolled across the bottom of the pot, leaving glossy trails of fat behind before the potatoes and carrots were added. They bumped against one another with soft sounds and settled into place as the onions began to soften and the tomatoes turned the broth a warm red. In 1953, in Knoxville, Knox County, Tennessee, a pot of stew like this cost about 74 cents. In railroad and textile mill workers' households, the dish often appeared toward the end of the week when a few cans remained on the shelf, but the meat compartment was nearly empty. She lightly browned the sausages until their surfaces were firm, then added cubed potatoes, carrots, onions, and tomatoes. The lid was placed on top, trapping the heat inside until the vegetables were tender and the saltiness of the sausages had seeped into the broth. When the lid was lifted, the aroma of cooked tomatoes and hot onions spread through the kitchen. The sausages had lost the cold appearance of canned food and had become savory pieces nestled among tender vegetables. The can had become dinner in a pot. Dish 19. Canned mackerel stew. The can lid popped open. The smell of oily fish immediately met the onions softening in butter. The two aromas blended, salty and rich, evoking the feeling of a harbor still damp with mist, even though the kitchen stood deep within a working-class neighborhood. In Morehead City in 1952, a pot of mackerel stew in the homes of dock workers and fish processing plant workers cost about 55 cents. She sautéed the onions and potatoes until the edges of the potatoes began to turn translucent, and poured milk or water into the pot. The mackerel was added last, each piece placed gently with a spoon so that it would hold its shape as the liquid began to boil. The potatoes softened the flavor of the fish, but the milk gave the broth a smooth, gentle quality. Some households used tomatoes to give the dish a deeper color and a slightly tangy taste. In this way, one small can of fish was enough to divide among several bowls. Pete served with saltine crackers on evenings when wind from the sea swept through the streets. Even after sitting on the shelf for a long time, the canned fish still remembered the dish number 14, pan-fried corned beef with potatoes. The best part of the dish lay at the bottom of the skillet, where the potatoes and meat had to remain undisturbed long enough to form a brown crust. She rarely stirred them constantly. She pressed the spatula gently against the surface of the mixture, listened to the fat softly sizzling, and waited for the aroma of potatoes browning at the edges to rise. In 1953, the dinner tables of steelworkers in Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, a skillet of corned beef and potatoes cost about 64 cents. Cold potatoes left over from the previous meal were chopped and placed in the skillet first. The corned beef was broken into small pieces, scattered over the top, and pressed into an even layer. After a few minutes, she slid the spatula underneath and lifted one corner to see whether the brown color had become dark enough. The dish could become a quick dinner or a late breakfast for someone who had just finished a work shift. An egg was sometimes fried beside it, its soft yolk running down over the crisp potatoes. Everything on the surface of the skillet looked simple, but the part most worth waiting for was always at the very bottom. The convenience of the post-war kitchen extended beyond cans. It appeared in baking dishes that could be assembled in the morning, placed in the refrigerator, then put into the oven when the sound of the door opening announced that the whole family had returned home. Potatoes, eggs, and make-ahead casseroles. On some afternoons, dinner was prepared by arranging the ingredients in layers inside a deep baking dish. Potatoes lay on the bottom, meat, eggs, or sauce were placed in the middle, and the top gradually turned golden in the oven. The oven door opened, heat carrying the scents of butter, milk, and cheese spread throughout the kitchen. The cook could step away from the stove, set the table, fold clothes while the baking dish quietly turned separate ingredients into a single meal. Dish number 13, potato and egg bee. The knife passed through the firmly set egg mixture and reached the tender slices of potato beneath the top of the pie. A thin wisp of steam escaped from the cut, carrying the scents of milk, eggs, and the freshly browned crust. The first slice was lifted from the pie plate, revealing evenly arranged rounds of potato-like pages in an old kitchen notebook. In 1953, in Irish-American textile worker families in Lowell, Middlesex County, Massachusetts, a potato and egg pie cost about 68 cents. She partially baked the crust so the bottom would be firm enough, then arranged slices of boiled potato with rounds of hard-boiled egg. A mixture of milk and eggs was slowly poured into the spaces between them, and the pie was returned to the oven until the filling had set. Potatoes and eggs were both easy to keep on hand, so the pie could appear at breakfast, at midday, or after a long work shift. No matter when it was served, every slice still contained tender starch, rich egg, and a crisp crust. Potatoes and eggs had become a complete portion. Dish number 12. Baked potato casserole cheese bubbled around the edges of the baking dish, making small crackling sounds as the final layer of potatoes finished softening. The aroma of beef, milk, baked potatoes clung to the coats hanging near the stairs. Then followed the person carrying the dish down to the church basement. In St. Cloud, Stearns County, Minnesota, in 1955, a dish of baked potato casserole cost about 86 cents. In dairy farming families and Lutheran church communities, she sliced the potatoes thinly and layered them with cooked ground beef. Cream soup was thinned with milk and poured over the dish, seeping down between each layer of potatoes. Finally, cheese was scattered across the top before everything was baked until the dish could be prepared in the morning, covered tightly, and left in the refrigerator until the afternoon. It often appeared on long tables after church services, at community meals, or on days when a family needed to bring food to a house in mourning. As the large serving spoon passed through the layers, potatoes, meat, and sauce were divided evenly among the plates. One casserole dish had kept the entire room seated together. Dish number 11, beef pie with a cornmeal topping. Dark red filling simmered around the edges of the baking dish while the cornbread topping rose high and turned golden. Small cracks appeared across the surface, allowing the scents of tomatoes, onions, and beef to escape in waves. When the first piece was cut, the soft crust pulled apart, revealing the thick, hot filling underneath. In 1956, in the homes of oil and railroad workers in Tulsa County, Oklahoma, a dish of this pie cost about 78 cents. She fried the beef with onions, added tomatoes and beans, and let the mixture simmer until the flavors had blended. The filling was poured into a baking dish, then completely covered with a thick layer of cornbread batter before being placed in the oven. A small amount of meat was spread across the entire bottom of the dish, while the thick cornbread layer ensured that every piece contained both filling and starch. Children often waited for a corner piece. The crust was crisper, and the meat juices had collected most richly. The cornbread covered the meat, then held its flavor inside every square slice. Baked casseroles made dinner more filling and convenient for a crowded household. But the post-war kitchen also carried another desire: to turn an ordinary weeknight dinner into something that seemed more formal, with smooth sauces, neatly arranged slices of meat, and the best serving bowl taken from the cupboard, suppers that felt a little finer. After the casseroles were substantial enough to feed a crowded household, post-war dinners sometimes carried a gentler wish as well. She wanted Tuesday night to feel a little different from an ordinary weekday. The tablecloth was smoothed, the finest bowls were taken from the cabinet, and familiar ingredients were prepared in ways that made them seem more formal. That sense of occasion came from a smooth sauce, a meatloaf cut into even slices, and a bowl of hot soup set on the table with both hands. Dish number 10, beef with creamy mushroom sauce. Just before serving, a spoonful of sour cream was stirred into the skillet. The brown sauce gradually became lighter, taking on a softer color and a glossier appearance beneath the kitchen light. The aroma of sautéed noodles, cooked onions, and beef drifted toward the pot of egg noodles waiting nearby, creating the impression of a recipe that had just stepped out of the pages of a family magazine. In 1956, in Detroit, Wayne County, Michigan, a batch of beef with creamy mushroom sauce cost about $1.10. In the homes of automobile factory workers, she thinly sliced the beef shoulder, quickly seared it in a hot skillet to keep the juices inside, then removed it. The mushrooms and onions were cooked in the remaining fat until tender. Cream of mushroom soup mixed with milk was poured in, and small bubbles formed around the edge of the skillet before the beef was returned. Sour cream was added last so that the sauce would retain its gentle richness. When spooned over the noodles, each strip of beef rested beneath a pale layer of mushroom cream, looking more elegant than the original ingredients. The can of soup had put on a new coat. Dish number 9, mock turkey loaf. The scent of sage and thyme arrived before the oven door was even opened. The aroma of poultry seasoning clung to the curtains and traveled down the hallway, giving an ordinary weeknight the character of a holiday. On the baking tray, the bacon wrapped around the loaf had turned brown and lightly glossy. In Muncie, in 1954, a mock turkey loaf in the homes of appliance factory workers cost about $1.18. She mixed pork and veal with breadcrumbs, eggs, sage, thyme, and the seasonings commonly used for poultry. The mixture was worked just until it held together, then shaped into a long loaf and covered with strips of bacon. When the knife cut through the brown crust, each slice appeared firm and moist. Drippings left in the pan were stirred into gravy and poured over mashed potatoes. The dish did not try to become a real turkey. Through the skill of the cook, it brought the flavor of a holiday to an ordinary evening. Even weekdays had their rituals. Dish number 8, peanut butter soup. A spoonful of thick peanut butter was dropped into hot broth and gradually dissolved beneath the circular strokes of the whisk. The pale brown color turned into a warm cream shade, while the familiar aroma of roasted peanuts became deeper and more savory as it blended with butter, flour, and milk. In 1952, in Suffolk in the Tidewater region of Virginia, families of peanut processing workers could make a pot of soup for about 60 cents. She melted the butter, cooked the flour until its raw smell disappeared, then whisked in the broth or milk a little at a time. The peanut butter was added afterward and stirred until every thick streak had vanished and the surface of the soup became smooth. The soup was ladled into the finest bowl and sprinkled with chopped peanuts to add a crunch beneath the spoon. An ingredient usually kept beside the bread now carried the rich, savory warmth of an elegant first course. The peanut had become a bowl of soup. Dinner could have ended when the final soup spoon was set down. But in many kitchens, leftover rice, the last few apples of the season, and a little flour were still enough to keep the oven warm for another hour, allowing the sweet scent of cinnamon to travel through the house before the kitchen light went out. Rice. Late-season apples and cinnamon sweets in the old kitchen sometimes began with things waiting to be used up. A bowl of rice left from the night before, a few apples that had begun to soften, or a little cinnamon still clinging to the bottom of the jar could all extend the warmth of the meal. After the main dishes had been cleared away, and the sound of spoons touching bowls had grown softer. The scent of sugar and fruit from the oven spread through the house once again. This was how the cook brought the evening to a close with care, allowing a day of labor to end with a little sweetness lingering on the tongue. Number 7. Baked rice with raisins. The raisins plumped within the custard, while a thin golden skin gradually formed across the surface of the rice. When the baking dish was pulled from the oven, the grains of rice around the edges made faint crackling sounds, carrying with them the scents of hot milk, cinnamon, and gently caramelized sugar. In 1954, in immigrant textile worker families in Providence County, Rhode Island, a dish of baked rice cost about 60 cents. She took the cold leftover rice, used a spoon to separate the grains that had stuck together, and mixed it with milk, eggs, sugar, and raisins. The cinnamon was sprinkled on last, leaving tiny brown specks across the surface of the mixture before the dish went into the oven. The heat set the custard around the rice, while the raisins became softer and sweeter. Some families served the dish beside ham as part of the main meal. Others waited until the end before spooning it into small bowls. Wherever it appeared, the bowl of rice from the day before had found a new job. Leftover rice still had work to do. Dish number 6. Apple dumplings. Each whole apple was wrapped tightly in dough like a small gift. The corners of the dough were pulled upward and sealed at the top. The hollow core was filled with sugar, butter, and cinnamon. When the hot syrup around the baking dish began to boil, the steady popping of bubbles sounded like light rain striking the porch roof. In Lancaster in 1954, a dish of apple dumplings cost about 50 cents in Pennsylvania Dutch farming families. She peeled each apple, removed the core, and placed it on a piece of rolled dough. After wrapping each one completely, she poured cinnamon syrup around the dish so the crust would bake while absorbing the thickening syrup. The dumplings allowed the last apples of the season to be used before they became too soft. In the evening, they were eaten while the crust was still crisp and the apple inside was steaming. The next morning, the remaining dumpling could be warmed near the stove and served with coffee. The late-season apple had been preserved for one more day. Dish number 5. Apple pie. The scent of apples and cinnamon traveled down the hallway before the crust had fully turned golden. The fragrance clung to the curtains, slipped through bedroom doors, and announced that the kitchen was still awake. Small slits across the top of the pie released steam, allowing the filling beneath to cook slowly while the apple slices retained their shape. In 1954, in Winchester, Frederick County, Virginia, an apple pie cost about 65 cents in the homes of fruit packing workers. He mixed flour with vegetable, shortening, and cold water, working quickly so the dough would remain cool. One layer was rolled out and placed in the pie plate, followed by sliced apples mixed with sugar and cinnamon. A second layer of dough was placed over the top, and the edges were sealed with her fingertips. Making apple pie required quiet precision. The crust had to be crisp enough to hold the filling, while the apples needed to soften without dissolving into liquid. When the pie was carried out, its fragrance often arrived before the footsteps of the woman holding the dish. The scent of the pie went before her. After the sweet taste of cinnamon and the soft crack of the crust beneath the knife, only 4 cards remained in the recipe box. The final lines brought the kitchen back to the most basic ingredients: cornmeal, molasses, a little beef, and rice. 4 supers in the recip box. After the scent of cinnamon still lingered on the rolling pin, only 4 cards remained in the recipe box. The writing on them was shorter, as though the cook's hands had already memorized the important parts. 1 card listed cornmeal, 1 mentioned molasses, the next called for half a pound of beef. The final card listed only rice, tomatoes, onions, and a pencil-written line so faded that the card had to be tilted beneath the light before it could be read. The final 4 dishes brought the kitchen back to its most basic principles. Leftover food was given a new life. An empty can became a bread mold. A small amount of meat spread its flavor throughout an entire pot of beans. A few grains of rice in a skillet were enough to bring the whole story of household skill to a close. Number 4. Cornmeal mush, with srup and fried mush, slices. The leftover mush was poured into a mold while it was still hot, its surface gradually smoothing beneath the back of the spoon. Overnight, the cornmeal mixture became firm enough for a knife to cut it into even slices. The edges of the slices were square, pale yellow, and still bore the shape of the mold. In 1951, Logan County, West Virginia, a batch of cornmeal mush cost about 23 cents. In coal mining families, she cooked the cornmeal with water, stirring it for a long time until the spoon left a deep groove as it passed through. Some of the hot mush was spooned into bowls and topped with a little syrup so that the sweetness soaked into every spoonful. The rest was saved for the following day. When the butter melted in the skillet, slices of mush were placed in it with a low sizzle. She left them undisturbed until one side had formed a brown crust before turning them over, keeping the inside soft beneath the crisp surface. In this way, one pot of cornmeal had 2 lives, soft and sweet in the first meal, then golden at the edges in the next. The old meal became a new one. Dish number 3. Boston brown bread. The loaf slid out of the coffee can with a soft, dry sound. Its surface was dark, moist, and smooth like a freshly cut piece of wood. When the knife passed through it, the aroma of molasses and grain flour rose into the air, richer than the loaf's rustic appearance suggested. South Boston in 1952, a loaf of bread cost about 38 cents in the homes of dock workers in Suffolk County. She mixed rye flour, cornmeal, and whole wheat flour, then added molasses and buttermilk. The thick mixture was poured into a clean, washed coffee can, tightly covered, and placed in a pot of hot water. Steam cooked the bread slowly, keeping the inside moist and firm. The kitchen remained cooler than it did on days when the large oven had to be heated, while a familiar cooking pot took on the additional task of steaming the bread. The dark slices were served with beans or sausages, soaking up the sauce at the bottom of the plate. The can that had once held coffee now knew how to make a loaf of bread. Dish number 2. Beef chili with beans. Small pieces of beef appeared among the dark red beans like a reward in every spoonful. The aroma of chili powder, cumin, tomatoes, and garlic blended with the steam and spread slowly through the room. The longer the pot simmered, the deeper the color of the broth became, and the more evenly the flavor of the meat spread through it. In 1955, in Fort Worth, Tarrant County, Texas, a pot of beef chili with beans cost about 75 cents. In the homes of stockyard and railroad workers, she browned half a pound of beef, then sautéed onions and garlic in the fat left behind. Beans, tomatoes, chili powder, and cumin were added before the pot was moved to low heat. Even a modest amount of meat was enough to flavor every bowl. The beans made the meal filling, while the stew grew richer each time it was reheated. Tonight's dinner could continue feeding the family at lunch the next day, when the sauce had become thicker and deeper in flavor. A little meat went a long way. Dish number 1. Spanish rice. The dry grains of rice touched the bacon grease, making small crackling sounds at the bottom of the skillet. She stirred slowly, watching each grain change from opaque white to pale gold. But only when the aroma of toasted rice began to rise was the can of tomatoes opened and the finely chopped onion added. In 1953, in San Antonio, Bexar County, Texas, a skillet of rice large enough to serve 4 to 6 people cost about 42 cents. In Mexican-American railroad workers' households, she toasted the rice in the fat until every grain was coated with a thin sheen. Onions, tomatoes, and water were added, and then the lid was closed so that the rice could cook in the steam. Beneath the lid, the grains absorbed the saltiness of the fat, the sweetness of the onion, and the reddish-orange color of the tomatoes. When the rice was tender and fluffy, she gently lifted it from the bottom so that the steam could escape evenly. The dish could stand on its own at the center of the table, or be served with beans, peas, and a little meat when the household had some available. Dish number 1 required no expensive ingredients. What turned it into dinner was knowing when to toast the rice. adding just the right amount of water, and having the patience to keep the lid closed. One skillet, a few familiar ingredients, and a pair of hands that understood every step created a meal substantial enough to feed many people. She understood every grain of rice. When the skillet lid was lifted, the final card had also been read. Steam from the tomatoes drifted past the corner of the recipe box, where the old paper still bore a round grease stain from decades earlier. The words San Antonio, 1953, at 42 cents were read one final time before the card waited to be returned to its old place. The 25 dishes we have just passed through were made in small kitchens, with cast iron skillets, enamel pots, baking dishes, cans of tomatoes, bags of rice, and hands that knew how to wait for the right moment. The macaroni was stirred until the sauce coated every piece evenly. The cabbage was cooked slowly until its sweetness emerged. The beans remained beneath the lid for hours. Cold potatoes were left undisturbed until the bottoms turned brown, while the rice had to smell toasted before the tomatoes were added to the skillet. At the beginning of the story, the recipe box was opened beside a dark stove. Now the final card has been returned to its place. She needed a few ingredients, but she understood each one in her hands very well. Those dishes gradually faded away as kitchens lost the time once devoted to soaking beans, saving pan drippings, and listening to potatoes crisp. Even an easy dinner still required care. If this story reminds you of someone who once cooked with whatever was available, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about the ordinary dish your family still remembers. The Spanish rice card was placed inside the recipe box. The wooden lid closed. The skillet was still warm, and the scent of tomatoes, onions, and toast rice was still waiting for the whole family to come home.